The beginning of spring in a rural village rarely arrives with the vivid certainty that people often imagine, for it does not unfold as a sudden transformation of color or warmth, but rather as a slow and almost hesitant softening of the world, as though the earth itself were reluctant to abandon the long, quiet discipline of winter. During those early weeks, the land does not yet awaken, yet it can no longer be called asleep, suspended instead in that fragile threshold where cold still lingers beneath fences and rooftops, while something gentler has already begun to breathe within the air. Snow, once firm and commanding, remains only in scattered remnants along the roadside and in shaded hollows, its surface darkened, its edges dissolving into the yielding soil, until winter itself seems less like a season and more like a memory reluctantly fading. The roads grow heavy, not from rain, but from thaw. Each step upon them carries a softened resistance, each movement pressing into the damp earth with a muted certainty that speaks not of hardship, but of transition. The air, thick with moisture and the scent of darkened soil, possesses a peculiar stillness known only to those who have witnessed the slow retreat of winter, a stillness that does not silence the world, but quiets it. And within such quiet, the smallest details acquire unexpected weight. A distant drip from the eaves, the faint murmur of meltwater finding its path, the hesitant call of a bird testing its forgotten voice. In this village, however, another presence marked the arrival of spring: bread. Not as food alone, nor as an occasional comfort drifting from kitchens on rare mornings, but as something constant, something that seemed woven into the very atmosphere of the place. For along the far edge of the village, where the main road gradually surrendered to a narrower path leading toward open fields, there stood an old house whose presence had long since blended into the landscape, modest and weathered, carrying the quiet dignity of structures that have endured more seasons than memory readily recalls. Yet from this house there drifted, almost daily, the unmistakable fragrance of freshly baked bread, warm, soft, persistent. So frequent was this gentle aroma that it no longer surprised the villagers, settling instead into familiarity, into habit, into that subtle rhythm by which rural life measures its days. Everyone knew the house, everyone knew the woman who lived there, and yet, despite the constancy of the bread, despite the quiet generosity with which it often found its way into the hands of others, no one ever truly understood why Eleanor baked so often. For one woman, living alone, could not possibly need so much bread. In a village, routines are never merely personal. They belong, in subtle and often unspoken ways, to the collective awareness of the place itself. For life lived in close proximity carries with it a quiet and constant observation, not born of curiosity alone, but of familiarity. People notice what repeats. They sense what exceeds necessity. They feel when something drifts beyond the ordinary rhythm of survival. Eleanor lived at the outermost edge of the village, where the houses stood with greater distance between them, where voices did not linger endlessly along the road, and where the world gradually loosened its hold on human presence, yielding to open fields and long unbroken horizons. Her house, modest and weathered by time, bore no outward distinction from the many older dwellings scattered throughout the settlement. Its roof slightly uneven, its wooden walls softened by seasons of wind and damp air, its windows gazing upon the narrow road with the quiet composure of structures long surrendered to endurance. Everything about her presence seemed natural, expected, unremarkable, except for one persistent detail that gradually unsettled the gentle equilibrium of village life. The oven was rarely cold. Smoke rose from her chimney with unusual frequency, not in the hurried bursts of winter necessity, nor in the occasional comforts of celebration, but with a steady regularity that defied simple explanation. The scent of bread drifted across the road day after day, warm, soft, unmistakably fresh. At first, no one considered it peculiar. Bread, after all, is the most ordinary of human labors, its preparation woven into the fabric of rural existence with such inevitability that its presence rarely invites scrutiny. Yet repetition carries its own language, and excess, however gentle, eventually acquires weight. One woman could not possibly consume so much bread. This truth did not emerge as suspicion. It arose as quiet arithmetic, as instinctive awareness, as the subtle disturbance of proportion. Margaret was among the first to fully recognize it, though not through deliberate calculation, but through that slow accumulation of observation which accompanies a life lived without haste, a life attentive to the movements of neighbors, seasons, and small irregularities. From her own yard, separated by only a few houses, she often glimpsed Eleanor moving along the road, her gait calm and unhurried, a loaf wrapped carefully in linen resting within her hands. The bread was not carried to market, nor to distant relatives, nor to any destination defined by necessity. It simply traveled, from door to door, from hand to hand, without announcement, without ceremony, without explanation. Eleanor never lingered long upon the thresholds where her bread arrived, never framed the offering as generosity, never infused the gesture with the quiet theatricality that often accompanies kindness when it seeks acknowledgement. Instead, she moved with a peculiar naturalness, as though the act required no interpretation, as though bread, like air or warmth, belonged not to possession, but to circulation. This absence of emphasis unsettled Margaret more deeply than any overt peculiarity might have done. For villagers understand need, they understand charity, they understand exchange, but they are less accustomed to patterns that resist naming. One morning, as the softened light of early spring filtered gently across the damp road, Margaret paused near Eleanor's fence, watching as the older woman emerged once more from her doorway, another loaf cradled carefully in linen. There existed within the scene nothing overtly unusual, nothing dramatic, nothing that could be called strange in any definitive sense, and yet the question, long deferred by courtesy and habit, finally pressed itself into speech, not from intrusion, but from the quiet human need to understand what repeats without visible cause.
In rural places, the movement of objects rarely passes unnoticed, for the geography of a village is not defined solely by roads and houses, but by patterns, by repetition, by that silent and deeply ingrained familiarity through which inhabitants come to recognize even the smallest deviations from ordinary routine. It was therefore inevitable that Eleanor's bread, which at first had been perceived merely as an expression of industrious habit, gradually assumed a different character within the collective awareness of the village, its presence no longer interpreted as coincidence, but as something approaching quiet constancy. Loaves appeared with a frequency that resisted simple explanation, their arrival unfolding without announcement, without request, without any visible structure of exchange that might have rendered the pattern comfortably intelligible. Some found bread resting upon their doorstep in the early hours of morning, its warmth still lingering beneath folded linen, as though the offering had been placed there only moments before discovery. Others received it directly from Eleanor's hands, encountering her along the softened spring roads where damp earth yielded gently beneath each measured step, where her movements retained the same calm deliberateness that had come to define her presence. There existed within these gestures no trace of urgency, no suggestion of obligation, no visible expectation of gratitude. Eleanor neither explained nor emphasized, behaving instead with that peculiar naturalness through which repeated action gradually sheds the appearance of intention and assumes the quality of inevitability. Margaret observed this unfolding pattern with growing attentiveness, though her interest arose not from suspicion, nor from disapproval, but from that quiet cognitive tension produced whenever human behavior resists the familiar logic of necessity. Villagers understand generosity when it follows hardship. They understand charity when it answers need. They understand exchange when it carries balance. Yet Eleanor's bread obeyed none of these recognizable frameworks. One afternoon, beneath a sky still pale with early spring light, Margaret encountered Thomas near the well, their conversation drifting with the unhurried ease characteristic of village life, where time seldom imposes the rigid demands known to more restless environments. It was Thomas who first articulated what many had silently perceived. She brings bread even to those who do not lack it. The observation carried neither accusation nor irony, emerging instead as simple recognition of proportion, as acknowledgment of a pattern that had quietly unsettled expectation. Margaret nodded, though her agreement was less intellectual than intuitive, for she had already begun to sense that Eleanor's actions belonged to a category not easily reconciled with ordinary motivations. Eleanor visited the elderly. She visited families burdened by modest hardship. She visited households whose circumstances bore no visible need of assistance. And always the same gentle ritual unfolded, the loaf offered with quiet composure, the encounter brief, the departure unremarkable. Over time, resistance diminished, questions softened. What had once appeared curious gradually merged into familiarity, for villages possess a remarkable capacity to absorb irregularities, to normalize what repeats, to integrate even the inexplicable into the steady cadence of daily life. Bread became part of the air, part of expectation, part of the unspoken architecture of existence. And yet, beneath this growing acceptance, Margaret remained unsettled by something she could neither define nor dismiss, a faint but persistent intuition that Eleanor's generosity did not arise from abundance, nor from habit, nor even from simple kindness, but from something quieter, something older, something whose origins lay beyond the visible present.
For there are gestures which speak not of necessity, but of memory. There are houses in which warmth exists not merely as a condition of temperature, but as a presence, as something woven into the quiet continuity of daily life, sustained by rhythms so constant that they gradually transcend the ordinary mechanics of labor and become inseparable from the atmosphere itself. Eleanor's house possessed such warmth. It did not arise solely from the oven, though the oven was rarely still, nor from the fire, though embers often glowed long into the evening, but from something subtler and far more pervasive, from the steady, unbroken cadence of work that seemed to inhabit the space with an almost meditative persistence. The air within her kitchen carried a density shaped by familiar and deeply human fragrances, flour resting upon wooden surfaces, dough yielding beneath patient hands, the softened scent of wood warmed by years of gentle heat, until the entire room appeared suspended within a quiet equilibrium of purpose. Margaret entered Eleanor's home for the first time on a morning touched by that fragile clarity peculiar to early spring, when sunlight, still gentle and undecided in its warmth, filtered softly through the windows, illuminating the muted textures of aged wood and pale linen. Eleanor stood at the table. Her hands moved slowly, not with visible strain, not with haste, but with the quiet assurance of gestures repeated so often that they no longer belonged to conscious effort, unfolding instead with the fluidity of instinct. The dough rested beneath her palms like something living, its surface soft yet resilient, yielding and recovering with each measured movement, its presence carrying that peculiar stillness through which the simplest forms of creation often acquire an unexpected gravity. Margaret watched in silence for some time, her gaze drawn not by novelty, but by the strange continuity of the scene, by the subtle impression that the process unfolding before her resisted ordinary boundaries of beginning and completion. Flour lay ready, a bowl of starter rested nearby, fresh loaves cooled beside the oven, and always upon the table more dough. It seemed not excessive, but perpetual, as though the cycle itself possessed no interruption. "You bake often," Margaret finally observed, her words shaped by careful neutrality, by the quiet courtesy that governs first encounters. Eleanor's expression softened with a faint, almost absent smile, though her hands did not cease their motion, continuing their gentle work with unbroken concentration. "Bread is never wasted." The reply emerged without emphasis, without defensive inflection, carrying the calm simplicity of something long settled within the speaker's inner world. Margaret allowed her gaze to drift across the room once more, her perception gradually assembling the quiet arithmetic of presence, ingredients prepared, loaves completed, the unending return of dough, until a delicate but unmistakable curiosity pressed forward. And where does it all go? For the briefest moment, Eleanor's hands slowed, not enough to constitute stillness, yet enough to register within the attentive silence of the room. "To people." The words arrived gently, though something within their softness carried a depth that resisted casual interpretation, a resonance not born of secrecy, but of memory. Margaret found herself observing Eleanor's hands once more, their movements patient, unwavering, imbued with that peculiar attentiveness through which labor ceases to resemble necessity and begins to resemble devotion. For there are gestures which do not serve the present alone, and there are rhythms sustained not by habit, but by something far more enduring. In a village, need rarely announces itself through words, for life lived in such intimate proximity gradually cultivates a quiet literacy of circumstance, a shared awareness through which the subtleties of hardship, sufficiency, and silent endurance become legible without declaration. People observe, they infer, they understand. Yet Eleanor's bread unsettled even this well-practiced comprehension, for its circulation extended beyond recognizable patterns of necessity, appearing not solely where want existed, but where no visible lack could justify its arrival. She brought bread to the elderly, whose lives had grown measured by slower movements and longer silences, to families burdened by modest economies, to children whose laughter filled the softened spring roads, and equally to those whose households bore every outward sign of stability. It was this final category that produced the greatest unease, for generosity directed toward hardship finds immediate explanation. Generosity extended toward sufficiency demands interpretation. One afternoon, beneath the pale diffusion of early spring light, Eleanor approached the home of Daniel, whose farm, fields, and well-kept yard spoke plainly of competence rather than deprivation, whose presence within the village carried neither the quiet fragility of age nor the softened vulnerability of need. Daniel received her at the threshold with polite perplexity, his gaze settling upon the linen-wrapped loaf with that careful restraint through which individuals attempt to mask discomfort beneath courtesy. "You should not trouble yourself." The phrase, though gentle, carried unmistakable hesitation, for the acceptance of unsolicited kindness often produces a tension distinct from refusal, a subtle disturbance of balance within the invisible economy of dignity. Eleanor's expression remained composed, her movements unaltered by the familiar resistance. Bread belongs everywhere. The response emerged without insistence, without moral inflection, articulated instead with the calm certainty of something understood as natural rather than charitable. Daniel accepted the loaf, not from need, but from the quiet social gravity that governs village encounters, where refusal risks unintended interpretation. Margaret, observing from a distance, sensed within the exchange something that extended beyond the visible surface of gesture, for Eleanor neither distinguished between households nor calibrated her offerings according to circumstance, behaving instead with a curious neutrality that dissolved traditional hierarchies of necessity. Bread moved without discrimination, without commentary, without visible structure of obligation. Over time, resistance softened into habit. Questions faded into familiarity. What had once appeared curious gradually assimilated into the steady cadence of village life, absorbed by that remarkable human capacity through which repetition transforms anomaly into expectation. Loaves appeared. Loaves were accepted. Loaves were no longer discussed. Yet beneath this quiet normalization, Margaret continued to experience a faint but persistent disquiet, an intuition that Eleanor's generosity did not arise from surplus, nor from impulse, nor even from simple benevolence, but from something quieter and far less visible. For there exist acts which seek no recipient, and gestures which answer not circumstance, but memory.
In rural life, labor seldom appears as a discrete activity bounded by clear beginnings or endings, for work does not interrupt existence, but rather composes it, weaving itself into the continuous fabric of days until effort itself assumes the quality of atmosphere rather than event. Eleanor worked in this manner. Her movements bore no trace of urgency, no visible strain, no restless acceleration that might suggest fatigue, unfolding instead with a measured continuity that rendered the distinction between labor and stillness curiously indistinct. Margaret found her attention repeatedly drawn to Eleanor's hands, not merely because of their constancy, but because of the peculiar character of their motion, which resisted the mechanical quality that repetitive tasks often acquire over time. Dough yielded beneath her palms with familiar elasticity, its living surface responding to gestures that were patient yet assured, firm yet curiously gentle, as though the process demanded not efficiency, but presence. Light from the window fell softly across the table. Flour rested in quiet readiness. The room remained suspended within its familiar warmth, and always the same unbroken rhythm. Margaret, who had long observed the cycles of village work, the planting, the mending, the endless succession of practical necessities, gradually began to sense within Eleanor's labor something that exceeded utility. For fatigue in its ordinary form eventually inscribes itself upon the body, upon posture, upon the subtle economy of movement through which effort betrays its cost. Yet Eleanor's hands did not reveal such cost. They moved with that peculiar steadiness characteristic not of habit alone, but of something closer to devotion. One morning, when the softened clarity of spring light filled the kitchen with quiet luminosity, Eleanor allowed a question long residing within her thoughts to surface, her voice shaped not by intrusion, but by genuine perplexity. "Do you never tire?" Eleanor did not immediately raise her gaze, her hands completing their gentle motion before stilling briefly upon the dough, as though the act itself required a natural conclusion before yielding to speech. A faint smile touched her expression, not amused, not dismissive, but distant. When one bakes for long enough, weariness ceases to measure the work. The reply, delivered without emphasis, carried a depth that resisted casual interpretation, for within its calmness there lingered something quieter, something whose weight belonged not to the present moment, but to a duration far more private. Margaret watched her resume the slow, deliberate movement of her hands, observing the continuity of gesture, the unbroken attentiveness with which dough was shaped, as though each repetition retained an inner significance immune to erosion by familiarity. For there are labors that nourish the body, and labors that sustain remembrance.
In small villages, personal histories rarely vanish entirely, for memory circulates quietly through conversations, through passing remarks,
through the gentle continuity of shared existence in which lives, though distinct, remain subtly interwoven. Yet there are experiences that withdraw from speech, not from secrecy, but from the quiet gravity of pain that no longer seeks articulation. Eleanor belonged to that category of individuals whose outward lives appear composed, steady, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding rhythms of rural routine, whose presence invites neither curiosity nor speculation, whose existence seems defined by the modest continuity of ordinary days. She lived quietly. She worked. She baked. And yet, within this visible simplicity, there lingered an absence so subtle that it rarely announced itself as thought, emerging instead as atmosphere, as something sensed rather than named. Margaret began to feel this absence with increasing clarity, though her awareness unfolded not as sudden revelation, but as the slow and almost imperceptible reorientation of perception that accompanies deeper understanding. One evening, as dusk settled gently upon the village, softening outlines and quieting sounds, Margaret sat beside the stove with Helen, whose temperament carried that quiet attentiveness shaped by years of observing human fragility without spectacle. Their conversation drifted through familiar territories, the thawing fields, the lengthening days, the subtle promises of spring, until Eleanor's name arose with unforced inevitability. Has she always been this way? The question, though simple, carried a weight neither woman could entirely ignore, for Eleanor's quiet constancy had long since transcended peculiarity, assuming instead the character of something that demanded interpretation. Helen's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, her gaze momentarily withdrawing into that distant interior space where memory reassembles itself. No. The response emerged softly, yet its brevity contained unmistakable gravity. Margaret remained silent, for tone often speaks before explanation. She once had a child. The words unfolded slowly, as though drawn from a place long undisturbed, their presence altering the very texture of the room, where firelight flickered gently against wooden walls and evening silence deepened. Margaret's breath stilled, not from surprise alone, but from recognition of significance. A boy. Helen's voice carried neither dramatization nor embellishment, articulating instead the calm factuality with which villages recall sorrow long absorbed into collective memory. He was frail. He was often ill. And he did not live long. The sentences did not fracture the silence. They became part of it. For grief, when old enough, settles into quietness rather than noise. Margaret felt in that moment the subtle but irreversible shift through which Eleanor's bread ceased to resemble generosity alone, its repetition acquiring a different and far deeper resonance. For there are hungers that belong not to the body, and labors that arise not from necessity, but from remembrance. From the moment Margaret heard Helen's words, the quiet architecture of her understanding began to rearrange itself, for knowledge, once received, rarely remains inert, unfolding instead through perception until even the most familiar gestures assume altered significance. Eleanor continued to bake. Her oven remained warm with the same steady constancy. The fragrance of bread drifted once more across the softened spring air. Nothing within the visible rhythms of village life appeared disrupted, and yet everything had subtly changed. For repetition, when viewed through the lens of memory, ceases to resemble habit and begins to reveal intention of an entirely different order. Margaret found herself observing Eleanor with a depth of attention previously absent, her gaze no longer searching for explanation, but absorbing resonance, sensing within the older woman's movements a continuity that extended beyond practical necessity. One morning, beneath the pale clarity of early spring light, Eleanor paused beside a group of children whose laughter filled the damp roadside with unrestrained vitality, their voices carrying that effortless brightness peculiar to youth. She stood among them, calm, composed, her expression softened by a gentleness that bore no visible trace of sorrow. A loaf rested within her hands, wrapped in linen, offered without ceremony. Margaret watched from a distance, and within that simple exchange there arose a realization neither abrupt nor intellectual, but deeply intuitive in nature. For bread, once interpreted as generosity, now appeared as something else entirely, something quieter, something bound not to those who received it, but to one who gave. Eleanor did not bake because bread was needed. She baked because baking itself had become inseparable from remembrance. For there exist absences which demand continuity. There exist losses which require ritual. There exist forms of love that, deprived of their original recipient, seek new pathways through which to endure. The arithmetic of proportion dissolved. The notion of excess evaporated. Bread was never excess. Bread was never surplus. Bread had become language, gesture, memory rendered visible. Margaret felt with growing clarity that Eleanor's labor belonged to that delicate category of human acts which sustain not the present alone, but the fragile persistence of something carried forward from the past. For hunger, once endured, leaves impressions deeper than the body, and love, once severed, rarely consents to disappearance.
There are forms of memory that do not reside within speech, for they neither seek articulation nor depend upon recollection through narrative, existing instead within the quiet continuity of gesture, within the steady repetition of acts whose outward simplicity conceals their deeper necessity. Eleanor's remembrance belonged to such a form. She did not speak of the past, not because it had faded, but because grief, when carried long enough, ceases to resemble an event and becomes a condition of being, an interior landscape through which one moves not with resistance, but with silent familiarity. Spring advanced gently through the village. Days lengthened with quiet inevitability. Light softened. The earth darkened beneath hesitant warmth. Life resumed its familiar expansions as villagers emerged from winter's inward stillness into the modest renewal of outdoor rhythms. And yet Eleanor's cadence remained unchanged.
The oven breathed with steady warmth. Dough yielded beneath patient hands. Loaves emerged with the same quiet constancy. One evening, as dusk settled with its characteristic gentleness, dissolving outlines and muting sounds, Margaret lingered beside Eleanor's fence, her presence shaped not by curiosity, but by something quieter and far less definable. Eleanor moved within the kitchen's familiar glow. Firelight flickered softly against aged wood. Bread rested upon linen. Everything within the scene bore the appearance of ordinary continuity. And yet Margaret perceived, with sudden clarity, something she had previously failed to recognize. Eleanor's movements possessed no trace of melancholy, no visible burden of sorrow. Instead, there existed within her expression a stillness almost luminous in character, as though the act of baking had long since ceased to accompany grief and had become something closer to communion. For remembrance, when sustained through love rather than despair, gradually relinquishes its weight, transforming not into forgetting, but into quiet presence. Margaret did not speak. Eleanor did not explain. Between them unfolded that rare and deeply human silence through which understanding emerges without language, without inquiry, without the fragile mediation of words. For there are truths that resist articulation, and sorrows that require no witness. Bread continued to cool upon the table. Firelight continued its gentle motion, and within the quiet equilibrium of that evening, Margaret understood what had never been offered for explanation. Bread had never been bread alone. The early weeks of spring possess a peculiar stillness, for the world, though no longer bound by winter's severity, has not yet surrendered fully to renewal, lingering instead within that fragile interval where endings and beginnings quietly coexist. The village breathed within this softened transition. Roads dried gradually beneath hesitant warmth. Light lengthened with gentle persistence. Voices carried farther through the thinning air. Life resumed its familiar outward rhythms. And yet Eleanor continued to bake. Her oven remained warm with the same unwavering constancy that had long since ceased to invite curiosity, its steady breath becoming as natural to the village as the rising sun or the turning of seasons. Bread emerged. Bread traveled. Bread was accepted without question. For repetition, sustained long enough, transforms even the inexplicable into structure. Margaret, whose understanding had deepened beyond inquiry, no longer regarded Eleanor's labor as generosity alone, nor as habit, nor as quiet eccentricity, but as something far more delicate and far more enduring. For there are acts through which love, deprived of its original recipient, discovers pathways toward continuation, reshaping itself not into absence, but into presence diffused gently across the living world. Eleanor baked not because hunger remained. She baked because hunger had once existed, because deprivation, once endured, leaves impressions deeper than memory alone, because love, once severed by loss, refuses extinction. Years passed with the unhurried inevitability characteristic of village life, where time seldom fractures experience into dramatic chapters, unfolding instead as continuity. And when one spring arrived in which Eleanor's chimney released no morning smoke, in which the familiar fragrance of bread failed to drift across the damp air, the village did not at first perceive disruption, only silence, a silence so subtle that it resembled hesitation rather than absence. Yet silence, too, possesses its language, and recognition followed gently, not as shock, but as understanding. Villagers spoke softly, remembered quietly, for Eleanor had long since become inseparable from the atmosphere of the place, her presence woven into routines so deeply that her absence altered not events, but sensation. The oven grew cold, the kitchen stilled, the fragrance faded, and yet something remained. For there are gestures that do not vanish with the hands that performed them. There are acts whose meaning exceeds duration. It is said that during the earliest evenings of spring, when light softens and air grows still, a faint impression of warmth sometimes lingers along the outer road where Eleanor's house once breathed with life. Some claim that the scent of bread, gentle and elusive, occasionally drifts across the fields. Others dismiss such impressions as imagination shaped by nostalgia. Yet whether presence or memory, the distinction scarcely matters, for bread, born of love, rarely disappears entirely. It remains within recollection, within atmosphere, within that quiet continuity through which human kindness leaves its most enduring trace. Bread had never been bread alone, and Eleanor's labor had never been excess. It had been remembrance. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a comment and tell us what you felt. We read every one of them. More quiet stories are waiting, shared slowly around the fire.